The body is so magnificent. Like, can we just hold space for how magnificent the body is, that it works for us to heal us? So when we deny our tears and we try not to cry and we try not to feel, it's so unhealthy because these tears are actually healing you. Welcome to the Stayin' Wild and Well podcast. My name is Rin, and my greatest accomplishment is being alive. Here we talk about life's journey, the ups, the downs, the in-betweens, all things mental health, body, mind, and spirit. We share wild stories and keeping your wild alive while staying well. I didn't know if I was going to be able to create this video today, but it's really fitting because the topic is grief. And I am moving through grief. And last night was really hard. I'm in the process of moving out of my home after being in a relationship for 17 years. And it's so interesting because even though I'm in full acceptance of this separation, there is so much grief. Taking a bath in my bathtub for one last time, holding my cat, looking around at my house. Grief is hard. And I always say the universe just brings things to you in divine timing. And the reason I chose to talk about grief is because I had a client last week come to session with so much pain and confusion. As they cried, they said, "I'm so confused. I feel guilty because I'm happy, but then I'm sad. And how can I be happy and sad at the same time?" And we spoke in depth. And so today I want to walk you through the different layers of grief, the messy in between, and how everybody experiences grief so differently. If you're moving through it, you're not alone. Grief is so deeply intertwined with love, and you don't know grief until you've known love. This video could be if you are grieving the loss of a family member, a relationship, a pet. If you are grieving the loss of a past version of you, if you are grieving something that you've never even had before, you can see the different layers of grief that we could feel and how there is no cookie cutter. There's no cookie cutter topic for grief. You can grieve something you had, you can grieve something you didn't have, you can grieve the loss of anything, including yourself. Holding space for all of it. So I have some notes here as usual, and the reason I have notes here is because I did a deep dive on grief, and I always speak to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her grief cycle. And I've spoken to clients about this grief cycle, and I'm going to read off the grief cycle to you because there's a bit of a misconception about the grief cycle. So the different stages. So they say that typically you go through denial, which is the refusal of the reality. Like, you don't want to believe this grief. You don't want to believe what's happening. You're denying the reality of the loss. Then they say that you move through anger. There's frustration. There's anger about the loss. How could this have happened? You might see different emotions pop up. You're yelling, you're screaming, you're throwing things, like you are upset. Then there's the bargaining, and it's an attempt to negotiate your way out of pain, to maybe not talk about it, try and push it away, try and rationalize. You're in that in-between phase. And then there's the depression. the deep despair, the sadness, the acceptance of the reality of what is, the pain of it. And then they say acceptance finally, where you accept what happened and you start to heal. And they say you go around this grief cycle. Everything I just told you, I want you to like throw it away. Throw it away. I used to believe that the grief cycle was like that. And I have gone through layers of grief in my life. Tremendous grief. Death and loss of self, and currently my separation. Currently I'm grieving a lot, so much so that I don't even know what I'm grieving anymore. Sometimes I'm crying and I'm like, what am I even crying about? There is no specific cycle and way to move through grief. What I've just named from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is greatly studied, and yes, these are cycles of grief that you move through, but nothing is cookie cutter. The thing is that you could be feeling depressed, and then you can go from depression to denial. You can go from acceptance to denial. The back and forth and the sway of grief shows up differently because we can be triggered in one moment. I know, I was triggered recently. I saw a video of somebody that I was grieving, and I cried for days about seeing this person in this video, and I was like, oh my goodness, like not even understanding what I was grieving and why I was grieving it. It takes something so small to trigger an emotion in the body. And grief is not one way. And also, you can't compare your grief. I've seen a lot of people in my life and a lot of clients compare their grief to another person's. Your experience is your experience based on your life and what you are moving through. Your pain is your pain. And the best way to think about this is when you see a child and say you took away their toy. They misbehaved, you took away their toy, they're on timeout, and they are crying and they are in tremendous emotional pain. They are grieving the fact that you took away their toy. That is their world and that is the reality. And the way they are crying and the passion and the emotion behind what they are moving through might look the same as you grieving the loss of a relationship. Because that is their world, that is your world. And that is why I say you could never compare your grief to anybody, because it's based on life circumstance and the way you've lived your life and what you've experienced. So it's holding space for all of it. In grief, what I find really beautiful is tears. We often deny ourselves from feeling, and I think crying is such a beautiful expression of grief because it's words that can't come out through action. It is emotions that are showing up. And what I learned is there's 3 different types of tears, which who knew? So the 3 different types of tears is basal tears, and this is like the moisturizing tears that we have in our eyes. Then there's your reflex tears, and reflex tears is if you get something in your eye, if you're cutting up an onion and your eyes start to cry. But then there's the emotional tears, and the beautiful, beautiful and crazy thing about these emotional tears is that there's a protein that's released through a stress hormone called lutein Anacephaline? I don't even know. I'll put it in the show notes so you guys can look it up. Leucine anacephaline. I'm saying it horribly. But I'm going to put it in the show notes for you. But this type of tear, the emotional tear and the stress hormone that is released is actually a painkiller. The body is so magnificent. Like, can we just hold space for how magnificent the body is, that it works for us to heal us? So when we deny our tears and we try not to cry and we try not to feel, it's so unhealthy because these tears are actually healing you. These tears are helping you get better and they are releasing a pain. So I thought that was really incredible and I wanted to share that with you. The other parts of grief that I'm going to just like get into the messy middle here is that grief is hard and it is messy. The type of grief that I have gone through has shown up in many different layers. And when we are grieving, our fight or flight response goes off in the brain. Fight, flight, or freeze. So you might run away, you might fight with others, or you might freeze. I have been in moments of complete freeze, laying in bed for days and not having the ability to move or do anything, not having the access to what I normally have access to. I know in the past when I've gone through certain levels of grief, I've gone for walks, I've put myself in nature, but then as of recent, going through grief and loss, it's like I was frozen in time. The energy it took just to bring myself to the fridge to nourish my body. The singing in the car in one moment and being like, I got this, I'm good. And then all of a sudden crying in complete pain. Feeling a grief in your heart where your heart actually hurts. Broken heart syndrome and grief is a real thing. There is proven studies that the heart actually swells when in deep grief. That's why when they say people die of a broken heart, it doesn't typically happen in the younger ages, but when we see that someone's spouse dies, we've often heard that another partner has a heart attack, and that is because the heart actually swells. Our bodies go through emotional pain when we are moving through grief. We may not be able to think properly. We may be having brain fog. The thing about moving through grief is I often have clients ask me, like, when is this going to be over? And the truth is, within grief, there's no specific time frame for when it's going to be over. It's holding space for all parts to show up. Allowing yourself to be beautifully human in what you are experiencing and what you are feeling. Because the thing about grief is it also generates empathy, this beautiful sense of empathy for you to show up and meet others where they are at. We have all experienced grief, and it's something that we all have in common that unites us as one, is this feeling of pain. No one is alone in going through life without feeling some sort of grief. It is a part of being human. I've always said the beautiful thing about being human is not reading things from a book. It's experiencing life, the beauty, the joy, the pain, the sorrow, the laughter, the adventure, the journey of the unknown. It's experiencing it all and holding space for all parts without judgment. When you are grieving, there are going to be moments where you don't even recognize yourself. I know that's been the case for myself. Looking in the mirror and wondering, like, are you in there? Who is this? The parts that are showing up. But to truly grieve means that you truly loved. And to truly love holds so much bravery, because to love means your heart is on the line. Because if that love fades away, if that love becomes a loss, there's pain there. And if you're grieving something that you never had, again, that is the desire for love. There is so much bravery in taking your love and moving through grief with it, and so much growth that comes from the grief that you experience. So when my client said to me, I feel guilty. How am I happy and how am I grieving? And I'm so confused, and what am I supposed to be feeling right now? Grief and joy can dance together. There is no grief without experiencing joy, and there's no joy that you could fully appreciate without knowing grief. To feel both, to watch the sway and the dance of both emotions move through one another in sequence. You are a beautiful human being, and you are going to feel all different parts. It's holding space for those parts. It's welcoming those parts into your life. The truth is that we don't actually get over grief. That is where we go wrong, is that we think that we get over grief, and the reality is that we choose to move forward. We choose to live anyways. We choose to create a life. We choose to lean into the joy. 20, 30, 40 years We could think about that moment and be filled with that grief again. But we could have so much appreciation for where our life is today because we've taken the steps to move forward.